Lowe's knows how to help you get the most out of your store run. That's why members save more with My Lowe's Rewards. Earn points towards My Lowe's money on eligible purchases. Get access to member-only deals and free member gifts. Plus, unlock free standard shipping when you reach Silver Key status. So what are you waiting for? Join for free today. Lowe's. We help. You save. Loyalty program subject to terms and conditions. Details at lowes.com/terms. Subject to change.
This is Fortune's Wheel, a podcast history of the late Middle Ages, and I'm Jonathan. In an effort to keep this show going, and one day being supported without ads, I'd like to invite everyone listening to become a supporting listener on Patreon. For as low as $1 a month, you can enjoy listening to various standalone series, such as the 7-part series on Poland's 11th century, as well as complimentary series that seek to fill in the gaps with information that didn't quite make it into the public show, such as the series called Context of a Conquest, in which we learn about various goings-on happening in the background of William the Conqueror's conquest of England. We are currently enjoying the series called The Book of Alexius, that has already shown the rise of Alexius Komnenos and will be updated with the bits of his story that don't affect the main storyline of our public show. If you support what's happening here and want to hear more, please head over to Patreon and become a supporting listener. The link is in the show notes of this episode. On this episode specifically, we see what Pope Gregory VII is up to when it comes to his southern nemesis. We watch Robert Guiscard make preparations for his next great adventure, and we witness Sicily come even closer to being a wholly Latinized political unity. Knowing what we now know about what's happening in Constantinople, this episode will directly set up one crazy adventure beginning soon. A lot happens on this one, so get ready. But I want to mention the title, which is a line pulled from the great autobiography called Tuscan Countess by Michelle K. Spike. Originally, this phrase was from Shakespeare's Richard III, and it has come to be recognized as a warning against political tyranny. By using this phrase, Spike got me thinking. We have a lot of people, a lot of characters on today's episode, so I want you all to think about who the people should have been most worried about taking full control of the medieval Mediterranean, European, Byzantine worldview. Now this is episode 133, entitled The Winter of Their Discontent. Thank you for listening, and I hope you enjoy the show. The walk to Canossa would quickly become one of the most enduring stories to emerge from the Middle Ages. A king humbled in sackcloth and barefoot, kneeling in front of the Pope begging for forgiveness and to be let back into the Catholic fold. It was and is quite powerful. It's an image that has overcome the test of time. However, besides royally pissing off Countess Matilda of Tuscany to the point that she donated every square centimeter of her proclaimed lands to the church in Rome, what did it really accomplish? John Julius Norwich, in his book The Other Conquest, writes, quote, Gregory's triumph was empty and ephemeral, and Henry knew it. His humiliation had nothing to do with repentance. It was a cold-blooded political maneuver which was necessary to secure his crown, and he had no intention on keeping his promises after they had served their purposes. End quote. So, as enduring as that image is of a king humbled before a pontiff, it served more as a cautionary tale for future kings rather than any realized restructuring of papal royal politics. It wasn't nothing, but it also wasn't the legend, what the legend has led us to believe either. So while King Henry IV returned to Germany, rejuvenated and full of vinegar, to begin an all-out war on his vassals, especially that Rudolph of Swabia chap who already claimed the crown of Germany as his, Gregory VII returned to Rome hanging his head. It was September of 1077. This was also the point when Matilda made her famous act of donation just to tie in what was on the last episode. The episode before our recent foray into Byzantine politics, that is. But Gregory would receive some more news upon his arrival that seemed to rub salt in his already festering wound in his honor. The first bit of news was delivered by one of the southern polities. Gisulf was there to inform the Pope that Salerno had officially fallen while he was up north on his fool's errand. Gisulf's brother-in-law, Guiscard, had had enough of this crap and stormed the city. In fact, by this time, Robert Guiscard had all but declared Salerno as his new capital city. Within days, another messenger came to deliver the news that the newly united brother-in-laws, Duke Richard of Capua and Aversa and Robert Guiscard, were laying a devastating siege from both land and sea on the very last holdout in the Mezzogiorno that wasn't Norman. That would be the city-state of Naples, still under Lombard control. Simultaneously, Guiscard had put his nephew to work, leading a force along with Richard's son into a central Italian vassal state of Abruzzi. Whose vassal, you ask? Well, Abruzzi was a part of the papal states, the lands and polities owned by the church itself. That's right. Guiscard had thrown down the gauntlet on what he thought a secular power by the Pope, and he invaded the papal states itself. But Guiscard wasn't finished. On December 19th, 1077, Robert Guiscard invaded the most powerful of the papal states, minus the newly acquired Duchy of Tuscany, that is, of Benevento. Abruzzi was one thing, but Benevento was another. This one might have stung a bit worse for Gregory because his mentor, Pope Leo IX, acquired this large duchy 27 years earlier when the Beneventans threw off their German yokes and voluntarily offered themselves to the bishopric of Rome, even building a massive palace for the Pope to stay in whenever he pleased. Norwich calls this, quote, a gratuitous insult to the throne of St. Peter itself, end quote. Oh, do you happen to remember one small detail about Robert Guiscard's relationship with Pope Gregory VII? Yeah, Guiscard was, at this time, still excommunicated from the church. It had been more than 3 years at this point. He was, as Norwich says, holding up the excommunication to ridicule. What this did is far bigger than just serving as a madman's land grab in southern Italy. No, read between the lines here. A pope's biggest punishment to hold over people's heads was excommunication. It's prodded wayward leaders back on track innumerable times in the past. In fact, just a year earlier, it brought a king and potential Holy Roman Emperor in a sackcloth to his feet. But here, this Norman, having been given the same treatment as the king, doubled and tripled down and took the fight to the Pope. Just below the surface of the story about Guiscard gobbling up land is a serious threat to the Pope's authority. If the populations within the papal states weren't safe under papal protection, then what's the point in being part of the papal states in the first place? How are they any safer than before? The Beneventans, without question, were asking themselves this very question. And it hit them. In Norwich's words, quote unquote, the Pope had no army and apparently no prestige either. So what was Pope Gregory VII's ace up his sleeve? What was the thing he was holding back for emergencies? Well, nothing, actually. And if there was any question that the Pope had been stripped of all authority and dignity, on March 3rd, 1078, 3 months after Benevento fell to Guiscard, Gregory simply excommunicated Guiscard a second time. Yep, Guiscard was officially on the Pope's double secret probation list, which incidentally was the punchline from the classic movie Animal House, released exactly 900 years earlier. It also reminded me of a Robin Williams joke about the police officers in London apparently not allowed to carry guns anymore. I don't know, it was years ago. He acts out the scene of a police officer yelling at a criminal, "Stop!" Or else they'll say, "Stop again." And anyway, if excommunication didn't work the first time, do you really think a man like Robert Guiscard would suddenly have a change of heart the second time? The only difference was it encapsulated more than just Guiscard and his men this time. This time it included Richard of Capua as well, who'd always pretty much remained good in the papal seat's eyes. And at first, Richard of Capua couldn't have given a rip either. But here's the thing. It was actually perfect timing, unbeknownst to the Pope. See, the news of Robert's and Richard's renewed excommunications made it to Capua within days. Norwich tells us that 3 days after the news arrived, Richard fell ill, and within a month, Richard of Capua was dead. Luckily for him, that was enough time to have his excommunication lifted, but only for him. His men, including his son and heir, Jordan, who had joined Guiscard's nephew in invading Abruzzi, were still under the ban. And Norwich gets a little soft here, and I'd like to share it because, if true, it humanizes a man like Robert Guiscard in ways we don't normally see. He writes, quote, Robert Guiscard was not by nature a sentimental man, but the news of his brother-in-law's death cannot have left him entirely unmoved. The two had arrived from Normandy at the same time, over 30 years before, and their rise to power had been rapid. For as long as many of their subjects could remember, they had together dominated the two great Norman communities of the south, building up the early settlements of Aversa and Melfi into the rich and powerful states they had now become. Like all good Norman barons, they had been at war for most of the time, but they had fought side by side as often as face to face, and if on occasion promises had been broken or friendship betrayed, that was all in the game. Neither bore any lasting grudge. Each had a healthy respect for the capacities of the other, and for the past 2 years they had worked in a happy, easy partnership that was proving highly profitable to them both. The Guiscard was now 62. For him, Richard's death must have meant the passing of an era. End quote. Unfortunately for Guiscard, Richard's death brought about something else too. An immediate shift in the power structures of the Mezzogiorno. See, Jordan was a good son to Richard of Capua. He did what he was told and he executed his orders well. But when Richard died and Jordan took the mantle of Prince of Capua and Aversa, well, his first decision was to travel to Rome and lay himself at Gregory's feet, begging to have his excommunication lifted. Gregory, knowing the boon this was to his recent fortunes, lifted the ban and Jordan was once again in the Pope's back pocket. Jordan's very next move was to order the removal of all land forces around Naples. Days later, when news reached Guiscard in Benevento, he knew the wind was completely out of his sails. He ordered his navy to lift the siege of Naples and his forces in Abruzzi to head back to Apulia. As for his big moves in Benevento, he called an end to those hostilities as well. And with Jordan basically giving Pope Gregory VII the much-needed military with which to stand against his Duke of Apulia, Calabria, and Sicily, well, Gregory was keen to exploit a little mess that was stirring in the undercurrents of Apulian society in 1078. By June, Gregory was staying in Capua, another telltale sign of his domination over Prince Jordan. About a month or two earlier, just after Guiscard had withdrawn all of his men from his various battlefronts, he had thrown a massive wedding for his daughter and the heir of the Marquisate of Este up in France. Up north, Norwich tells us, it was customary for vassals to pay the expenses of such an event, but his vassals in Apulia weren't buying it. Because of where Guiscard started out, the sixth son of a minor noble in Normandy, it's not like they're meeting the costs of Duke William of Normandy's daughter's wedding or something. They paid it because, well, they really didn't have a choice. But this was coming to a boil underneath it all, and Gregory VII sought to take advantage of the unrest. Norwich calls this next revolt against Guiscard, quote-unquote, well-organized and widespread. And it kicked off at the instigation of Gregory himself in September or October of 1078. The men at the top of the revolt are some old nuisances of Robert's, his nephew Abelard, his nephew Geoffrey of Conversano, and the man he tied to a fence and marched up to his city walls, daring the people to attack their leader, this guy, Peter of Trani. Norwich blames these men still being in places to lead revolts after causing so much trouble in the past on Guiscard's quote-unquote lack of vindictiveness. The details are much the same as all the other revolts in Apulia and Calabria during Guiscard's time, but there was one interesting episode in which Guiscard broke his way into the city of Taranto while simultaneously getting reports of his wife Siculgata's own siege on Trani, which she was devastatingly successful with, by the way. Dispatching his wife seemed to do the trick in this revolt, not to mention having his two sons seeing time on the battlefields of southern Italy. His two sons, remember, Roger Borsa and the older Bohemond. Presumably, Bohemond was with Guiscard, while Roger Borsa was with Siculgata. Either way, each boy was getting a serious education in warfare, regardless of which parent they were with at the time. It took just 9 months to quell this rebellion. By the year 1079, Apulia and Calabria were at peace once again, and Robert Guiscard even reached a peace deal with Prince Jordan of Capua, which was a big blow to Gregory VII's dreams of turning the tide in the south. What's more was that poor Abbot Desiderius of Monte Cassino was the one pulled into the proceedings once again. I'm telling you, Desiderius, all he'd ever wanted was for Monte Cassino to just be left alone. But for 3 decades now, 3 decades and counting, Desiderius had been dragged into one council after another in order to help two sides come to an agreement. Monte Cassino was a battleground for much of these things, and his prestige was really the only thing keeping the abbey from descending into the fires of warfare around it. What's more was the reports coming in from the north that King Henry IV, a much different young man than the shrunken fawn of a boy at Canossa, had taken care of things in Germany, reestablished himself as the one and only king, and began gathering forces to march against Rome. 1079 passed in much this way, an anxiety-fueled nightmare descending further into deeper and deeper domains of despair. But Gregory VII was not one to be cowed or stopped. He'd been through so much, and signs across Europe were appearing that his reforms were actually taking hold. This pumped him with moments of encouragement, and he ran with them as far as he could. Now, after a year of sitting on things, Pope Gregory VII had succumbed to his predicament. After decades at the very top of papal politics and almost 8 years as pope, he knew very well that there was an infinitely higher chance of gathering the Normans back under his influence than he had in getting Henry IV. So by March of 1080, Norwich tells us that Gregory's letters and pronouncements were softening when it came to the Normans. One of the two sides had to give, and Henry IV was simply not going to be that side, not after his humiliation at Canossa. In her book Tuscan Countess, Michelle Spike declared, quote, "Everything began to unravel after the Lenten Synod of 1080, end quote. At this synod, Gregory decided to throw a Hail Mary, but it absolutely backfired. Softening to the Normans was one thing, but supporting rebellion in Germany against Henry IV, that was something completely different. Gregory went so far as to double down on what he declared exactly 4 years earlier. Gregory VII declared Henry IV was no longer the king of Germany. He excommunicated Henry IV once again, and he went one step further. Gregory VII formally declared Rudolf of Swabia the king of Germans. Rudolf and Henry IV were in the midst of another massive civil war for the crown of Germany at the time, and it seemed to be at a deadlock. The two had fought another battle just a month earlier, in February 1080, but there was no clear victor. That's how the war had been going thus far. By throwing his papal hat into the ring and announcing that people were not bound to follow Henry's rule, he hoped the popularity meter would swing in Rudolf's direction. And of course, upon hearing the news out of Rome in June of 1080, just 3 months later, Henry gathered his clergy and nobility together and doubled down on his previous decree that Gregory VII was no longer pope. This time, though obviously driven by Gregory's most recent denunciation of Henry, the reasons given for Henry's decree against the pope focused on things like Gregory VII's Jewish heritage. Remember, his grandfather was a Jew who converted to Christianity. and a renewed fury around Gregory's initial elevation to the papacy after the death of Alexander II. And though meddling in German affairs was one supposed crime, the 27 dictates were the real casus belli for Henry's decree. No one had ever dared go on the offensive toward the German crown quite like Gregory VII, and it seems he was, again, after the Lenten Synod of 1080, beginning to pay the price. It was at this council, in Bressanone, that Henry elevated Archbishop Guiberto of Ravenna to the papacy. Guiberto, the same man who welcomed Henry IV after his walk to Canossa, was now named Pope Clement III. However, history would forever know him as anti-pope. Spike gives us a pretty clear statement on this topic. She writes, quote, King Henry against anti-King Rudolph. Pope Gregory VII against anti-Pope Clement. In retrospect, the names they're now known by make obvious who won. It was not so clear then, end quote. But we're told that Gregory still felt confident in his position in Rome. It was he, as deacon and advisor, convinced Pope Nicholas II to finally look the other way in Duke William's marriage to Matilda of Flanders. It was he who led the way for Pope Alexander II to send Duke William a papal banner supporting the man's conquest of England. It was he who sought continuously to weaken the German crown, and it was he who constantly negotiated and renegotiated the fealty of the southern Normans under the papacies of Leo IX, Nicholas II, and Alexander II. Whether he was known by Gregory VII or Archdeacon Hildebrand, he was the one who courted and reprimanded and re-ingratiated himself with the Normans all over Europe for the better part of 30 years, the same 30-year period that saw the largest expansion in Norman history, from England to Sicily. And here's the key point. In Gregory's mind, there was absolutely no possible way that Normans under the rule of Robert Guiscard or King William I would ever forsake him and leave him high and dry. The problem was, Normans are Normans. Normans thought about expansion, glory, power. Every relationship a Norman leader had was always conditional, and its first condition was based on what that Norman was after in that moment. And in 1080, William the Conqueror was still gaining footholds in England, as well as dealing with his unruly duchy, not to mention its ambitious neighbors and his wayward son from time to time, Robert Curthose. And as for Robert Guiscard, he was ranting and raving about the Byzantines again. But this time, he was preparing for a great invasion. He was geographically between these two Norman powerhouses, but they were both looking in opposite directions. These two just needed a little reminder, Gregory supposed. Spike writes, quote, So he reminded William of England on April 24th, 1080, quote, I am sure that you know how devoted I was to your interests before I was raised to the summit of priestly rule, how useful I showed myself to you, and with what zeal I labored to advance you to your royal state. End quote from Hildebrand as well as Spike. And within a month, Gregory had dispatched none other than Abbot Desiderius of Monte Cassino to get Robert Guiscard at the negotiation table once again. At the city of Soprano, about 3/4 of the way from Rome to Monte Cassino, on June 29th, 1080, Guiscard and Gregory came to an agreement, thanks to the impossibly complicated mediation by Desiderius. Guiscard's landholdings were renewed by the Pope, and his new acquisitions, those of Salerno and Amalfi, minus Abruzzi, Naples, and Benevento, would be recognized as well. Gregory also lifted the excommunication from not only Robert Guiscard, but for anyone and everyone under him. In exchange, Robert Guiscard placed his massive hands between Gregory's, Norwich describes, and pledged to be at the Pope's side should trouble arise. In essence, Guiscard promised to be, from that day forward, the Pope's champion. Interesting wording, though. Guiscard would be the Pope's champion. Keep that in mind. And this agreement couldn't have come at a better time, because just north in a little village at the time called Brixen, but today just inside of the modern Italy's northernmost borders in the Alps, as we said earlier, it's called Bressanone. See, King Henry IV was holding his own council, and this is where he gathered his multitude of German and Lombard bishops and noblemen, and together they repeated their decisions a few years earlier to kick Gregory out of the papacy, only referring to him as Hildebrand once again in the official reports. We had mentioned this earlier in the show. Who would take his place? As we know, Archbishop Guibert of Ravenna, now called Pope Clement III. With renewed vigor, Gregory VII called upon Matilda of Tuscany to gather her Tuscan noblemen and amass an army to march against anti-Pope Clement III, who was still in Ravenna. Now, Robert Guiscard made his way back to his new capital of Salerno in July, just a few days later, in July of 1080. And with Apulia and Calabria now at rest, the 64-year-old needed a new challenge. To him, the Germans were a nothing burger. He couldn't care less about what they were planning, what was happening up north, so long as they didn't intervene with his next big idea, which was taking on the Eastern Roman Empire. Remember, he's still stewing on the idea that his daughter Helena was wasting away in a Byzantine convent. To him, it was less about his baby girl and more about the Byzantines keeping a possible political chess piece that is rightfully his to maneuver from him. And where did Robert get the idea that he could take on the Greeks? I mean, he did kick them out of Bari, didn't he? He beat them on land, and his little brother beat them on the waves. And as John Carr in his book, The Comneni Dynasty, says, I mean, much of southern Apulia and most of Calabria were Greek-speaking. As far as he was concerned, he was already the ruler of Greeks, so why not go after the whole thing and make himself the official emperor over all of the Greeks? Robert also knew the Greeks really well by this time. See, we can't forget that for centuries, southern Italy was firmly Greek in culture, language, customs, government, and trade practices. Eastern Rome was fully in charge of the region before the Lombards moved south and pushed them aside. But the Lombards actually adopted many of the same practices. Norwich calls the Greek civilization a quote-unquote heady fragrance, which I quite like. The art and architecture, their stories, their social structures, the Lombards adopted them all and kept them going. By Robert's time, the Lombards were as Greek as the ancient Romans had been. And the Normans, too, over the previous 6 or 7 decades, had breathed in and become intoxicated with the heady fragrance of Greek civilization. The Norse-French hybrid language they spoke, well, it began stealing various words and phrases. As an example, Norwich writes, quote, "It has not been unusual for peoples finding themselves in close proximity to the Greeks to develop, on the cultural level, a marked inferiority complex. It happened to the Romans and later to most of the Slavs. The Turks have not recovered from it to this day, and the Normans, even the invincible, confident Normans, were no exception." End quote. The Normans were becoming as Greek as the Lombards had been in their first decades in the Mezzogiorno. Robert felt like he knew these people and that he could take them on. The reports that had flooded across the Mediterranean about the empire's 1070s spelled nothing but disaster, and with a new 70-year-old emperor installed just 2 years earlier, with no apparent heir, well, I mean, the vultures had to have been circling, surely. Norwich writes, quote, "Her ancient glory remained, but her greatness was gone." End quote. This could be Robert Guiscard's greatest moment in an already legendary life. Norwich continues with a good look at perspective. Quote, 35 years earlier, he had arrived in Italy, the 6th son of an obscure and impoverished Norman knight. The throne of the Eastern Roman Empire would make a fitting end to his career. End quote. Now, the deposed emperor, Michael VII Ducas, had actually enjoyed a nice retirement, which is a shocking change considering the last guy had his eyes gouged out and suffered miserably on the back of a donkey, with maggots festering in his empty sockets for days. In fact, records indicate that Michael Ducas, quickly rose to become the Archbishop of Ephesus, one of the original 5 leading churches in the entire Christian world. But at the time, he was quietly moved around until he found his way to Ephesus. Within a year or two, that is. For all anyone knew, because he was moved around so much at the beginning, for all anyone knew, in 1078 to 1079, even 1080, he could very well have been dead. The new emperor, another old grizzled general in much the same mold as Isaac I Komnenos 2 decades earlier, Nicephorus III Botaniates, who we know pretty well by this time, immediately negated the marriage alliance between Guiscard's daughter, Helena, and Michael VII's son, Constantine. Now, Malaterra writes the following explanation for this action, which is, of course, filled with Norman bias, but it might not be too far from the truth, as the Greeks were notoriously xenophobic when it came to outsiders entering into the nobility of Eastern Rome. Malaterra writes, quote, "The Greeks, however, were afraid that if heirs who were born from a wife from our race," meaning Norman, "were to grow up in the palace, then an opportunity would be created for our people to come there freely, and a people who were customarily devoted to luxuries and self-indulgence rather than to warlike exercises would be trampled underfoot by the valor of our men and made their subjects. They were careful to keep the duke's daughter shut up under strict guard to prevent her marrying any powerful man." End quote. So in late 1079, Guiscard, absolutely livid at the new emperor, sent a vassal named Count Radolf of Pontois as an envoy to Constantinople to place a formal protest against the new emperor's actions against his daughter and the previously agreed upon betrothal. So when in 1080, Michael Ducas arrived in Salerno to beg Robert Guiscard to help him back on the throne of Constantinople, thus renewing the marriage alliance between his daughter and Michael's son, Constantine. Wait, what? Yeah, Guiscard hosted the ex-emperor, who was happily carrying out his dream of burying himself in texts, running a massively influential church, and living a life of comfort in academia and peace. Of course it was Michael Ducas. How dare you say otherwise? Well, John Carr, in his book, The Komneni Dynasty, writes that Count Radolf returned over a year later, quote, with sobering news that he had seen the real Michael VII living in monastic retirement, exposing the charade by the monk, end quote. Anna Komneni, in her book, The Alexiad, chalked it up to 2 things. This situation with Michael VII showing up in Guiscard's court in Salerno. 1, the man was a monk named Rester, who was pretending to be Michael VII on his own accord. And 2, Guiscard specifically created the entire ruse with an unnamed monk acting as Michael VII. The vast majority of contemporary or near-contemporary accounts, save only 2, chalk this up as a ruse and nothing more. But it was an alluring ruse that did the trick. Both Robert Guiscard and Pope Gregory VII used it, whether they believed it or not, to their advantage. Gregory blessed Guiscard's mission to push eastward, which makes sense in the context of Gregory's crowning of a Croatian and a Duclian king already. Guiscard had pretext, at last, to attack Constantinople. We will take a deeper look at Guiscard's pretext for war on the next public episode, but this was indeed the surface-level reason for what he does next. Geoffrey Malaterra writes the following poetic description of Guiscard's preparations for his Balkan invasion this way. He says, quote, "Arranging matters as follows, but keeping his plans secret, he sweats over the preparations to win Byzantium for himself. From lands all about, he seeks raw materials. Nothing is overlooked, no matter, however, humble, ignored. Things which were formerly despised now seek to play a useful part. The most skillful woodcutters are summoned, the carpenter's art is brought together from lands all around, trees are cut down and fall, they are cut up, and the woodworkers plane the planks. The smiths bring irons to the fire, the anchor is forged, a mold for nails is prepared, the hull of the ship is built, fastened together by nails. Some men fill the gaps in the lower part with down, and then others hasten to cover this over with liquid pitch. Some stitch the sails, others devote their attentions to the ropes. A whole fleet is made ready, not just the one ship is prepared. Our hero is eager and determined to make his numbers grow. With everything ready and the ships equipped with care, the first sails over the liquid sea to Otranto. End quote. While Guiscard was preparing his invasionary force in Taranto and Otranto and Salerno on the mainland, Count Roger was busy in Sicily, eroding what was left of Muslim control on the island. If we draw a line across the island from Agrigento in the west to Catania in the east, all but 2 fortresses and cities and towns above that line were still held by Muslim emirs. The indomitable mountaintop fortress of Enna, right smack in the center, and the eastern port city of Taormina, just north of the volcano Mount Etna and south of Messina. Roger had long known Messina was the key to the entire island, and though Taormina had not caused any trouble whatsoever so far, he knew that he needed to eliminate the potential threat once and for all for him to feel that Messina was truly safe. Roger began his siege against Taormina in late 1078, but it went for months. In 1079, Roger was seen traveling from one encampment to another on the outskirts of the besieged city, and some defenders rushed out to take the count out, as Roger didn't bring many men with him. In this moment, Roger's life was under the biggest threat since he'd entered the island almost 2 decades earlier. Roger was ambushed and outnumbered before, but this time he really didn't have but a handful of men with him, and the oncoming group heavily outnumbered them in that moment. The Normans immediately flipped into battle mode, but it was too little too late, except for one. A Breton knight in Roger's company, named Eviscard, stepped in front of Roger at the last moment. He allowed Roger the extra few seconds to ready himself, and Eviscard fought valiantly for Roger's safety. It seemed to be nothing more than a hit-and-run operation, because no one stopped for an actual fight. The ambushers clashed and then kept moving, escaping into the hills around them. When the dust settled, Eviscard lay dead. Malaterra writes, quote, "So the death of Eviscard helped God to save the life of the Count." End quote. Roger, being exceptionally devout in many ways, recognized this as God's work, much like Malaterra had written, and Roger, in the name of Eviscard, gave generously to the poor and various holy places around Sicily in thanks, says Malaterra. Malaterra also shows his disgust for these ambushers and Islam in general, when he then described Roger punishing all people in the area, quote-unquote, of that superstition, meaning again, Islam. He also adds a short eulogy for Eviscard, the Breton knight who saved Count Roger of Sicily from certain death. Quote, "At his burial there was great lamentation by the soldiers, for by his merit the Breton was dear to everyone. May the reward for his faithfulness be to obtain peace, since by his death in the Count was granted life. In showing himself so loyal, how different he is from Judas. The latter, by selling God, and afterwards hanging himself, purchases death and is branded with his treason. Eviscard gave himself to the enemy's knife for another. His hope was to save his lord and gain reward for himself. These two ought not to be considered equals in virtue. One was a traitor, the other strives to save. He will receive an angel's wing, the other will go to hell." Pretty harsh for Judas, but, what else would you expect when you sell your best friend, your rabbi, your savior, for a handful of silver coins? But this juxtaposition between Judas and Eviscard shows us that loyalty among fighting men was greatly cherished even 1,000 years ago. Especially, maybe, 1,000 years ago. Judas, to these folks, and many even today, is about the lowest of the low, but Eviscard, now a symbol in Sicily for virtue and high character, should be lifted up. He was set up as a model for how everyone should act. After this episode, Roger would not be so careless again. It served as a reminder of the precarious nature he was still in certain parts of Sicily. It was good and fortunate lesson that he was not in full control quite yet. Sicily was still an enormously dangerous place, despite him riding the wave of Norman conquest over the previous few years. Roger ordered more ships to cover Taormina and for surrounding camps to be on high alert, and he pressed in slowly at this point. Enough was enough. But he started to hear reports of more piracy occurring, supported by the Zirid Emir back in North Africa. He immediately ordered naval support at Tropina, Palermo, and Messina, but a full blockade around Taormina and Reggio back on the mainland, which were close enough to each other, being across the Strait of Messina, that they became effectively a full blockade of naval traffic through the strait. On the horizon, Roger saw one day a fleet of 14 ships, and he knew that battle must be imminent. But it seems that the Zirids weren't notified of the naval support Roger had somehow whipped up, seemingly overnight, and they retreated back to Syracuse, the last major holdout on the island besides Enna. At this, the people of Taormina negotiated terms, and Taormina became the last Muslim-run place in the Val d'Amone and Messina regions. In celebration for his good fortune, Roger ordered a massive building policy across northern Sicily. It seemed a church popped up everywhere, from Trapani to Troina, another few in Messina, and even Palermo. Roger built and funded the construction of Latin churches everywhere. Palermo, as of 1079, was the only place on the entire island that had an official bishopric, but this changed now. Roger ordered a grand church be built in Troina, his current capital and home base, granting it the status of a bishopric, which Pope Gregory VII agreed to, but coupled his approval with a warning that Roger was breaking the Pope's rules against investiture. With Henry IV threatening him, he couldn't possibly afford to make an enemy with the only Norman he seemed to actually support fully, as Roger had always treated the papacy well, and he was the only Norman actively spreading Christianity into Muslim lands, so there's that too. As Roger was touring the Val d'Amone and its massive construction projects, word came that more than 13,000 Muslim families about 20 kilometers south of Palermo had suddenly refused to pay their taxes. Well, that's a lot of money. See, between running back to the mainland to help Robert with his latest rebellions and Roger's own funding of naval support, he had had to raise taxes, and people in western Sicily simply refused to pay the increase. Roger showed some of that master diplomacy that would become a hallmark of Sicilian rule by not attacking these rebels outright. Instead, he sent several envoys to coax them into doing the right thing. When that failed, he sent another round of envoys to try to negotiate, but the rebels wouldn't have it. They couldn't pay the increase, and that was that. Then Roger ordered fortresses be set up nearby at Partinico and Corleone. This threat still wasn't enough, and one city in particular became a center for the rebelliousness that emerged just south of Palermo in 1079. The city was called Aietto. At that point, Roger raised a small army and invaded the area. Even a mighty show of military power didn't dissuade the rebels. Roger still did not outright attack the people, per se, but he did something no less devastating. He ordered a full burn of all the fields. It was autumn, harvest season, and the Sicilians in the area would suffer an agonizingly deadly famine through the winter because of it. They ended their rebellion as their fields burned, except for Aietto and another city called Sinisi, which was close by. Now, Aietto was a tricky little city to take, which is why it became a hub of rebel leaders. It was atop a very high peak and had deadly cliffs on three sides. The other side had a man-made trail leading up to the only gate. It was very easy to defend. Roger focused the bulk of his forces against Aietto and another smaller force besieging Sinisi. The people of Aietto were prepared though. They refortified their placements and brought their vast flocks of birds and herds of sheep and goats into cliffside caves inside the city walls. They could hold out a little while. Roger set up Normans and Sicilians at Aietto, while he led a contingent of Calabrians outside Sinisi. Malaterra writes, quote, "And so at one and the same time, he conducted 2 separate sieges in the same area and maintained them both most effectively. He moved very shrewdly from one to the other, eagerly pursuing and encouraging them, dealing with every matter himself, leading attacks on the enemy, frightening them sometimes through feints and sometimes by raids, cheering up his own men by generous gifts and even more generous promises to enhance their loyalty to him, and he continued to do the enemy damage." End quote. Roger ends this by burning the fields around Aeto as he saved them, hoping to break up the rebellion in the city before such measures be employed. Aeto, devastated, joined the other areas, which had already had their fields burned, and gave up the cause. As for Senisi, Roger ordered his entire army to this smaller holdout, and the people of Senisi didn't waste a moment. They surrendered immediately, and the fields around Senisi were not burned. We could end this episode with Roger putting down this rebellion in western Sicily, but there was one more little detail about him that I would like to share with you all. It's an interesting little side story about Roger's legacy, so here goes. It involves the King of France. Yeah. So King Philip of France was married to Bertha, the stepdaughter of Count Robert II of Flanders, also known as Robert the Frisian. The problem was that King Philip didn't want Bertha as a wife any longer. He tried numerous times to pack her off to a nunnery or just have the entire marriage annulled, even appealing to the Pope for help. One such instance took place in 1079, and by early 1080, he had reached out to Robert's court in Sicily to ask for Roger's daughter's hand in marriage. Yes, the King of France asking for a marriage with the daughter of a Count of Sicily. Who knew?
This episode is brought to you by Hyundai. Think you know what an electric vehicle should be? Think again. From the charge time and range in the Ioniq 5 and 6 to the 601 horsepower Ioniq 5N, Hyundai is redefining what EVs should be. Learn more about Hyundai EVs at HyundaiUSA.com. EPA estimated 303-mile driving range for 2024 Ioniq 5 SE SEL limited rear-wheel drive and 361-mile driving range for 2024 Ioniq 6 SE long-range rear-wheel drive with fully charged battery. Actual range may vary.
Malaterra writes the following of Emma of Sicily, quote, "She was a very pretty girl whom Roger had by his first wife Judith." End quote. In fact, Malaterra adds that Roger knew nothing about how Philip had treated Bertha and that Philip was actually still officially married to the woman. He agreed to terms which would afford him the throne of all of France. Are we seeing echoes of Robert Guiscard's ambitions toward Eastern Rome here? But as we know about medieval arrangements, it just wasn't that simple. See, when young Emma was shipped off to the mainland in France, she was welcomed by Count Raymond IV of Provence, the man put in charge of Emma and her immense dowry by King Philip himself. That was fine by Roger, as Raymond IV of Provence was already his son-in-law, having married another of Roger's daughters, Matilda of Sicily. Yes, another Matilda. He had done this a few years earlier. But a lot was underfoot to undermine the whole proceeding. King Philip had a change of heart, but intended to keep the dowry, which was a considerable one to say the least. Count Raymond rooted this plot out and decided to get out ahead of it, but not in some honorable way. Let's not kid ourselves here. He sought to do the same thing as the king planned. He just sought to do it first. The only thing that stopped either plan from succeeding was the fact that Roger had sent some of his most experienced and loyal men to be her champions until the marriage to the French king. The men secreted the dowry back on their ships, and they sailed back to Roger in Sicily. The thing was that they left young Emma with Count Raymond. If either man wanted the dowry, they must first marry Emma. That was impossible for Raymond, so it was up to King Philip. And King Philip, well, he'd already moved on. He was done with it. So what would happen with Emma? Count Raymond IV of Provence kept Emma in his court on the mainland for 7 years until he could marry her off to someone of high standing. Looking ahead, it wasn't until 1087 when a marriage alliance was negotiated with the second Norman Count of Montescaglioso in Apulia, northwest of Taranto. This guy's name was Ralph Maccabees. By 1093, though, Emma of Sicily was married to Duke William II of Auvergne in France, who was also Count of Clermont at the time that Pope Urban II would give his fiery speech in 1095 that kicked off the First Crusade. The story of Emma of Sicily, fourth and youngest daughter of Count Roger and his first wife Judith, being an important part of Apulian politics as well as being a witness to one of the most important speeches in human history. Well, she stands as another testament to the greatness of the Hautevilles during the 11th century. But see, here's the thing, and believe me, I know I'm starting to sound like a broken record when I say this. The Hautevilles aren't even close to being finished yet. So if I'm sounding like that broken record, just imagine what the people of the time must have been thinking. When will this ever end? Will it ever end? Well, the fact that we're still talking about this one family 1,000 years later is a pretty good indicator that their impact will never not be felt across the Mediterranean. But before we get out of here completely, put a little bookend on this episode, there's one last thing that occurred, something that Spike illuminated as the beginning of, quote-unquote, the winter of Gregory's discontent, hence the title. So if you remember from, much earlier in the episode, that army that Matilda gathered in Tuscany back in July of 1080, with the express purpose of marching on Ravenna and capturing the antipope named Clement III, well, they went, this army. They went. They left Mantua in mid-October of 1080 and followed the Mincio River before pitching camp in the foothills of the mighty Alps. Spike tells us that the army set up camp near the hilltop village called Volta. Spike writes, quote, "I visited that village and looked down on the great sweep of plain below, which is now neatly squared off into fields dotted with prosperous villas. From that superior vantage point, unseen fighters loyal to the Lombard bishops quietly watched Matilda's forces approach. They waited while her men removed their helmets and laid down their shields and swords, ate their evening meal, and prepared to rest. Sometime that night, the fighters in Volta swooped down the slope in a surprise attack. Matilda's men fled in disarray, abandoning their newly worked armor on the ground where it lay." End quote. And it was this minor rout of the forces loyal to Antipope Clement III and Henry IV that broke Matilda's Tuscan army and allowed Clement III to remain in Ravenna. But see, something else occurred on that very same day, October 15th, 1080. Well, okay, the cause of this event actually occurred the day before, so let's start there. On October 14th, up along the White Elster River in western Germany, anti-King Rudolf of Swabia, a proud member of the Hohenstaufen family, was in hot pursuit of Henry IV. He chased Henry's forces to the White Elster and learned that Henry's forces were awaiting reinforcements, much needed reinforcements, who would arrive anytime. Rudolf decided to attack before these reinforcements arrived. His own infantry was also a little out of sorts as it had lost a lot of its own men, so Rudolf ordered his mounted knights to dismount and bolster the infantry lines. Well, this took away from the mounted knights that he kept around him as protection. Skirting the bogs, both sides' infantries slammed into one another and fought on the soft, muddy ground just to the side of the White Elster River. And it was a bloodbath. Henry's forces were indeed routed, and they made a run for it. However, as the battle was winding down, Rudolf found himself still fighting against Henry's knights, when one of Henry's men swung his sword down and cut Rudolf's sword hand, completely severing it from the arm. In the shock of the situation in the moment, the man quickly pulled his sword back and then thrust it with all his might into Rudolf's belly. The men separated at this point, and Rudolf's men dragged him back for medical attention, but 900 years ago, there was so very little, if anything, one could do to help a man who had had his hand severed and was then stabbed in the abdomen clean through the back. Rudolf hung on through the night, somehow, but he succumbed to his wounds the next day, October 15th, 1080, the same day Matilda's men marched and were ambushed. The winter of Gregory's discontent, as Spike says? Well, indeed. In a matter of 24 hours, not only had his only hope in Germany died, but so did the chances of capturing the anti-pope. Until next time.